Hello, welcome to our Pandemic Perspective series, Voting During a Pandemic. We're delighted that everybody was able to come today. We would certainly like to see you all in person, but given the situation, we will do it this way instead by Zoom. The American History Building has a long tradition of doing colloquiums. This has been going on for many years. The Pandemic Perspectives series is 10 different sessions that we will have basically every other week from now until February. Whoops. The series is something that we enjoy doing, that we can share the views of everybody. What we have today is an outstanding panel of scholars, and we're delighted to have them here with their expertise. Duchess Harris from Macalester College. Not only is she a PhD, so she's also a JD. So she's got pistols in 2 holsters, and very prolific author. One of her recent books is Black Feminist Policies from Kennedy to Trump, many other works. But the series that she does that really impresses me is a series of over 100 books, 120 books written for 4th to 12th graders. So Duchess is really working on making history available to everyone, not only adults, but children as well. So it's a real challenge to do that. From the National Postal Museum, we have Lynn Heidelbaugh. Lynn is a curator who does both military mail and the material culture of writing. She has done numerous exhibitions, including Behind the Badge, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and My Fellow Soldiers, letters written from home during World War I. And finally, our third panelist is John Grinspan, a curator here in the Division of Political History at the Smithsonian. His research focus, as he says, is the deep, dirty history of American democracy. Certainly very appropriate for our times today. He is especially interested in the ground on the campaigning and voting during the 1800s. He is a frequent contributor to the New York Times. I would highly recommend the opinion pieces that he's published in just the last month or two on the elections, insights in the past, and how you can better understand what's going on. His book, The Virgin Vote, has been highly acclaimed and is something that I would recommend to everyone. Our session today is looking at really at 2 things. We're certainly looking at both the pandemic and voting, and how these 2 come together in interesting ways. We all believe that we're living in extraordinary times with the pandemic raging, and we also have an election going on. Both feel tremendously unusual, but the question to the panel today is this really unusual? We've had pandemics in the past, the influenza of 1918, yellow fever, polio in the 50s, and we certainly had elections in the past. And are the occurrences of the election this year so much different than they were in the past? In terms of housekeeping, a few things to remember. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or comment, we really encourage you to be part of the conversation. Just type it into the Q&A box, and we will try to answer your questions. if you put your screen into speaker mode, you'll probably press the little buttons up on the right. It'll probably be best if possible. I'm afraid that we can't help with tech problems, but we suggest if something does go wrong, just to sign off and sign back on again. And for recorded, we are recording this for later view. So if you go to our website, you'll be able to see it. And our next session coming up is November 24th, and is comfort food during a pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to move on to the first segment, registering voters and campaigning. And we have a number of different views, different things from the collections that we can share as a jumping off point. And we hope that you will be able, our panel will be able to react to these and give us interesting comments. Here are some posters from the collection. And what I'd like to ask our panel is indeed the campaigning during a pandemic different at other times? Is the registration of voters different now than it was before?
I guess I studied the 1800s, so I can speak to that, and other people can speak to later moments. I'd say every election is unusual. It's not that this is not unusual. It's just that every election has always been unusual. The idea that things would be precedented, I think, is really kind of a problem to begin with. That everything comes from somewhere new, and every election shows some new permutation. In the 1800s, registration is really different because there's just no real national or state registration in most places. Most states don't have registration, and most communities you vote based on recognition. If somebody recognizes you, knows you're in the community, knows you're old enough to vote, they let you vote. If they like you, they might let you vote illegally if you're too young, and maybe not if they don't like you or they don't like how you're going to vote. So it runs into this question we've been dealing with a lot these days about challenging. So voting kind of is tied really into intimate community life in the 1800s. It's a little different today when we vote in large communities where we don't recognize our neighbors.
I would say that, my expertise is actually more 20th, 21st century. How the pandemic impacts voting is linked to Lynn's expertise in terms of the mail, and how, people in this election have wanted to vote through the mail because they did not want to stand outside in areas around people where it's not required everywhere where people have a mask. And the idea of using the mail and that the ballot might not get in has been a concern.
Yeah, and from thinking about the mail, it really has been an area that the military has been able to access voting through, and being deployed, whether it's overseas or stationed in another state than their residency. And on the topic of registration, that has been part of the difficulty of during deployment or being stationed elsewhere, is to be able to register in those states that require registration in person. And like I think we'll talk a lot about today, the different access to voting is determined by the states, and certainly how they use the mail and access to absentee voting is done state by state.
I guess
I think that I've got the sharing poorly done. Can you all see the slide now?
We can see it within the larger PowerPoint.
Huh.
What if you click from the beginning?
Okay, now we're going. My apologies. So Duchess, how does in terms of suppression of vote, do you see differences in systems? Does everybody have equal access, and is the pandemic making it actually easier or harder in terms of signing voters up?
I think the pandemic is making things a lot more challenging. This piece of material culture that we have right here, I think, is really interesting. As people can see, this is, a sign from registration headquarters. And you indicate probably Warren, North Carolina, so I guess we don't know, in 66. The year 66 is important because the Federal Voting Rights Act passes in 1965. And so here you have this sign from the NAACP saying, register now. But what I think is also really important is prepare to speak for yourself at the polls. And I think that can be read in many different ways. It's similar to what John was saying, that, in the 18th century, people might recognize you. But in this time, in 1966, it's like, who's going to vouch for you? That's what it could possibly mean. Prepare to speak for yourself. It also could be encouraging Black voters at the time to come with their documentation, their proof of residence, and all the obstacles that are going to be reinscribed in the 1960s that started in the 1860s and 70s with like poll taxes and things like that. And so I love this piece of memorabilia because it really does indicate definitely some differences, but similarities from previous times and looking at the moment now.
So once people are registered, certainly the campaigning begins, and rallies are one component of this. Do you see a big change in terms of rallies during pandemic eras? Here on the right, you see a rally. It's actually a Liberty Bond rally from 1918 when there was a pandemic. And down below, we have a Trump rally from February, actually before the pandemic was very large in the US.
Yeah, so I mean, in the past, the problem is for quite some time, until the beginning of the 20th century, most Americans weren't aware of the germ theory of disease. So they were still engaged in pandemics even when they weren't quite aware of it. So they would have mass political rallies in the 19th century, 20,000, 40,000 people filling Union Square or central town squares throughout America to rally to kind of fire people up in a political campaign. And along with them, they bring the tuberculosis bacillus and all these, typhus and all these diseases that they are spreading when you get 20,000 people shouting in the same square, rubbing shoulders elbow to elbow with each other. So pandemics and epidemics really do spread through these events. They're just not as aware of it until 1918. They have a more solid understanding of medicine and disease. And we kind of thought there would be no rallies in this election, certainly no unmasked rallies, but we've seen that hasn't been the case, that people, even with full awareness, will continue to hold political rallies if they feel that it's to their advantage.
Yeah, I really agree with John. I mean, I look at this image on the left, and it shows the rally from February, which in February, of course, no one would be wearing a mask because, we weren't really aware of the pandemic and people weren't wearing masks yet. But I would argue that this kind of rally that would have happened last week would have looked similar. As recently as days ago, people were attending mass rallies without masks.
Now, beyond rallies, another component of campaigning are parades. And we have a couple slides here that if you all want to talk about parades, I can sort of flip through these, but maybe John, you can begin because you're the expert on the 19th century parades.
Yeah, so the way you ran a campaign for the second half of the 1800s was you got a large group together, usually young men. You put them in uniforms, kind of military style uniforms. You gave them torches and they marched down Main Street at midnight. They were almost always nighttime parades. They always had torches. Often they had slogans, banners, fireworks, whiskey. And just as we've seen in this election, where rallies often are faced by counter rallies and these trains and these kind of conflicts, people would turn out to counter rally and counter march. And when all the people you want to vote out of office are marching down Main Street in one big mass, it's pretty tempting for people to just start throwing bricks at them or whatever. So there's a lot of political violence in the past drawn out of these events. That kind of these big public rallies and parades are inherently about confrontation and dominance to some degree. They're supposed to fire people up, but they're also saying we own the town square, our party controls the narrative, and they often do bring out violence, as we've seen yet again today. And the museum has this incredible collection of torches, dozens and dozens of torches from these marches from the past. And when we see torchlit marches today, it kind of causes us to panic a little bit. But this was just the dominant way almost every political party, from abolitionists to the first KKK, campaigned in the 19th century. That's just how people express themselves. And it really fired people up. This is an era when voter turnout reaches the highest levels in American history, and partisanship and political engagement are really high. So it succeeded. It didn't necessarily make great politics, but it made engaged politics.
John, if I can interrupt for just a moment with a question from one of our viewers. They want to know the technology behind these, at least in terms of a big rally. How, before amplification, how could a big crowd actually be addressed?
Well, that's a great question. If you read the letters and diaries of people who attend these rallies, the thing they comment on most is the oratorical skills of the speaker. Someone would get up on a stage as some speaker, and they really, more than the substance of what they said or the policy planks, they talk about the timbre of their voice, their poses, the way they could project. If you weren't a good speaker, you'd be chased off the stage. If you were a good speaker, you'd gain renown. The man who ends up assassinating James Garfield, the second presidential assassination in American history, had been a kind of failed stump speaker who was embarrassed about his speaking previously during that campaign. There's a really big history of this kind of stump speaking, politicking, speechifying. And also during Reconstruction, when African Americans get the right to vote, many people take skills they earned or built sermonizing and speaking at churches and turn them to politics. So there's just a big public culture. It's called a nation of speechifiers. People are just really inclined to stand on a soapbox and yell about politics. People are pretty ready to go when it comes to that.
So one of the questions, of course, is when do these parades cease to be about sharing good things and become intimidation? So here we have a 1925 Ku Klux Klan parade, and then possibly even of greater interest is the 2011 alt-right parade in Charlottesville.
Well, I mean, I can speak to Charlottesville. Like, I appreciate you, Peter, mentioning that I wrote the books for young people, because I actually have my Charlottesville book here. And it's not just a shameless self-promotion. I know you can't really see the image, but it's of someone carrying the shield, which is important, connecting to the tiki torches and the Confederate flags that we have here. And Charlottesville is important because it shows that in less than 10 years ago, we are evoking the 1925 Klan image rally. And it shows that there is a pattern that when you get more progressive-leaning candidates in office, there's often a pushback where you get this kind of uprising in public performance.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I just want to put in a little pitch for the power of objects. That tiki torch we collected, it's from Home Depot or Lowe's or something. And if you look at it close up, it's just a backyard tiki torch. It's flimsy. It probably won't last all that long in our collections, even though we take good care of our objects, because it wasn't made to be a historical symbol, and it's become this incredibly powerful and recognizable thing. So sometimes material culture tells us more about politics than any speech or any video or anything like that.
So if we can wrap up our section here on campaigning, another important component is the door-to-door work. How has this aspect of campaigning really changed during the pandemic? Is it still as vital as it was before? Duchess, is this something that you can speak to, the door-to-door campaigning?
I mean, definitely. I mean, I didn't want to step on Lynn's toes because I think this like overlaps some with how this is done, in the midst of, mailings in the pandemic as well. But I think that, this kind of memorabilia is critical in terms of, either celebrating candidates or also sometimes denigrating others. And so I think that's what we can learn from these pieces. Like all these pieces here are, supporting the candidate that, someone's being advocated for instance. But as we know, there's other literature that's left at people's doors that do different things.
Yeah, and part of that literature, people's doors, is the mail. Well, I'll go into that in a second, but the slide that you just pulled up here, Peter, is speaking of another pandemic. You see a letter carrier there with his mask on during the 1918 influenza pandemic. And it was a lot of fear at the time about the spreading, how letter carriers may be spreading it when they come to deliver the mail to your door, and particularly in rural communities as well, that may have been much more isolated, except they had just started to have door-to-door delivery just expand in the last 5-10 years. The pieces that you have here now is some of the campaign flyers. Pieces like this are found in your mail today, with direct mail pieces that are campaign mail and created by the parties, and really use the best marketing techniques of the day. These have to be paid by the parties. Very different than some of the pieces we'll talk about later of the election mail pieces, which comes from the states, created by the states for absentee balloting, requesting ballots, and so forth. So these are under different kinds of regulations, but they are a money maker for the Postal Service as well. As if you can have more of these direct mail pieces in your mail stream, that will boost revenue.
It's an interesting point that you raised about money making. Has the attitude towards the postal delivery been that it should be a money making operation throughout the history of the country? Could you give us a little more depth?
Yeah, that goes back to the very beginning. It actually goes back to when it was the British Post Office and run by the Crown during the colonial period. The British Post in the 1600s, 1700s was very much trying to run the colonial post as a money-making venture. The rates for the colonial mail was extremely high, and they were pretty much losing money every year in that effort and keeping the mail costs very high. Early nation US, it becomes a debate from the very beginning about access to the mails and information, and should the post office be a conduit of information, and can that be used for informing the constituents? Should you make a informed voter base, or how do we control that information? A lot of that was decided in some of the early postage rates that were set that created low rates for newspapers. And therefore the mail stream was heavily used by newspaper printers that could get their news out. And of course that would get the political party views in those papers. And there was a lot of machinations about who is controlling the access to that mail stream, and whether they were at points pulling those papers and censoring those papers. And that was a really big part of 1918, as well as censoring the news. Really, the Postmaster General went after the socialist newspapers, a lot of German immigrant community newspapers during the war period, and controlling that kind of information by shutting down their permits for lower rates on the news. So it's always been part of the debate about the Postal Service. Is it a public utility, or does that service then have to be self-sustaining? Because it's one of the few government agencies that was able to create revenue. If you look at any others, it's really the sort of customs, and before there was ever an IRS. And so the post office is one of the few ways that the government can raise funds. And should that funds be self-sustaining, or what, how has been the continued debate?
I'm sure that debate will go on for quite some time. One of our viewers has asked an interesting question about collecting and wants to know whether we are collecting robocalls, and if not, should we?
Yeah, it's something we struggle with every 4 years or every 2 years. The question of collecting robocalls, the question of collecting memes and digital campaigning. We never collected radio ads. We rarely collected TV ads. There's a whole world of politics that is kind of more out in the ether and harder to collect. We never collected, obviously, face-to-face campaigning when that was the dominant approach. So we haven't collected robocalls or memes all that much, but at some point in the future, we probably will begin to. It hasn't been the approach of the museum. We've been mainly focusing on collecting material objects you can put behind glass and a person can be face-to-face with.
Great. Well, let's move on to our just one quick point. John, you want to say something about the classic front porch campaign?
Oh yeah, I mean, it emerges really out of a fight between politicians and the bosses who run the parties. That one way to get around the bosses who kind of dominate campaigns for president is to hold a front porch campaign, to really from your own porch campaign. You can it's seen as inappropriate for a president to campaign for much of American history. It's seen as kind of lacking in virtue for a president to go out there and really run on their own behalf. But if you're just sitting on your porch and they bring the people to you, you're not really crossing that boundary. You're just greeting visitors. So they would build these huge machines to bring hundreds of thousands of visitors to McKinley's front porch in 1896. It's really a growth in the role of the presidency. There's a sense in the late 19th century, people were really upset with how democracy is working. They see it as kind of broken and rigged, and they start thinking that an individual leader, a president, might be able to clear up what legislatures can't. That there are too many crooked people in these crooked legislatures. If we just had one bold guy, one McKinley, one Teddy Roosevelt on his porch, he could solve these problems. So they really represent a growth of the power of the presidency, which has just continued to grow for the last 100 years after it.
Great. Well, let's move on to the election itself. Once the campaigning is done, people need to actually vote, and the machinery of the election is something that the museum certainly excels in. We have a significant collection of ballot boxes. Interested to hear what our panel thinks about these mechanisms. How do the systems for voting really matter, and especially how is it affected by the imposition of the pandemic? John, you want to lead this off, and I'll flip through some of these artifacts as you speak.
Sure. These objects are going to fall into kind of two categories: the 1800s, and then from the 1890s on. In the 1800s, the way you usually vote in most places, if you have the right to vote, is you get a piece of paper, you get a ballot, and you go put it in a box. And there are people who stand around the box, poll judges who are supposed to make sure that it's fair, and challengers who are supposed to keep people from voting illegally, or sometimes keep people from voting the wrong way as they see it. The benefit of the system is it's easy to engage in for people who don't understand much about the system. It's easy for immigrants, for people who are illiterate. You take the ballot, you put it in the box, it's pretty easy. And it gets great turnout, right? That's the benefit of this old system. It really is successful in bringing working class and immigrant people into voting. That's one of the benefits of it. Around the 1880s and 1890s, reformers say this system is crooked, the system is unclean, the system encourages violence, and they try to create all these ways to mechanize voting to clean it up. But in the process of cleaning it up, they're also shutting down access for some people who don't necessarily know how to read a ballot, don't necessarily know how to mark a ballot. So these objects of reform, like those ballot markers you showed before, they're a way of making voting cleaner, but they're also a way of shutting it off for people who aren't as comfortable, immigrants, illiterate people, sometimes African Americans, sometimes young people who aren't as comfortable using these mechanisms, these formal things like writing down your ballot, they really cut some of those populations off. So I think it's just a trend we'll see in this election. Every technological development in voting opens a door and closes another. There's a trade-off with every aspect of this. And my favorite example of it is that big green voting machine, the Gillespie voting machine. They introduced something in 1898 that seems really innocuous, but makes a huge difference. When you activate that voting machine to register your vote, that green curtain would pull shut behind you. And instead of voting with your community, instead of voting with the whole eyes of the community, kind of knowing how you're going to vote, watching you cast a ballot, you're alone with your conscience in a voting booth, isolated. It really creates a change in how people perceive democracy as opposed to a kind of social communal democracy in the 19th century, which is engaging, but also somewhat violent and irrational, to a kind of more independent, isolated, individualist democracy in the 20th century, where you are alone in the booth with your vote. So these tiny mechanisms, a curtain, a marker, they help some people participate and they close others off. They really change how politics works in our lives.
Duchess, did you want to say something about the more current mechanisms of voting and perhaps the famous butterfly ballot?
Sure, definitely. I mean, I really think that the image on the left here of the Votomatic vote recorder is an important teaching tool that I would use in my classrooms. So I teach undergraduates at McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I teach about 20th and 21st century politics. For instance, I have a course called the Obama presidency. One thing that I have been humbled by is that if I try to talk about the 2000 election between Bush and Gore and try to have a discussion about hanging chads, I realize they have no idea what I'm talking about because first year college students were born in 2002. And so to actually have this image where you can see where people voted by punching it in, so you can see that it might be partially punched in or not, and that's what a hanging chad was, that's invaluable for this new generation. So I think these objects are incredibly important and just fantastic.
Whoops. Sorry about that. I tried to change slides.
Is your mouse working, Peter?
It doesn't. Resume slideshow. There we go.
All right.
So here's the hanging.
Yeah, there's the butterfly ballot right there. And that's also a closer up image. And so, we don't vote like this anymore. And so if you are talking to a certain generation, you can't really say, remember how we used to vote, even though it feels just like yesterday to me. And so I think this is a fantastic way of understanding how voting has been complicated by the technology of the time changing the moment.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It makes me just think how makeshift it all is, that like this was the ballot that decided an election 20 years ago. It's basically gone today. We don't recognize ballots from other eras. The way they voted in the 19th century, you get a bucket and you put the ballots in it essentially. It's amazing how this is supposed to be the core of our democracy, and it's so makeshift and often neglected. I think we really need to start thinking more deeply about, and paying taxes to pay for it, but more deeply about how our elections actually work.
Now, you mentioned about poll watchers. You want to expand on that, on who's allowed to, how to watch polls and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, in the 1800s, I mean, there's really no registrations. There are in some states, but they can't really check them that easily. So what happens, and this is a really high period of partisanship, really intense partisanship, often violent. So they're guys who stand at the polls. There's nothing formal, there's nothing legal. They're just a Democrat and a Republican or a Whig who stand at the polls and say, I know you can vote, I know you can't vote. And they often, if they see people in more violent elections, if they see people who are going to vote the wrong way, who they believe are going to vote against their party based on their clothes or their accent or their town or their race or their ethnicity, something gives the challenger kind of a tell, they would use violence and intimidation. There was something they would do in the 1840s and 50s called awling, where they would take a shoemaker's awl and kind of essentially stab a potential voter with an awl as a way of saying, don't vote, things are going to go badly if you do this. I mean, a lot of this is a really ugly system. In the 20th century, we get more formal systems of poll watchers, rules on where partisans can stand and where they can't near the polls. That kind of develops more formally out of this really like bare knuckle approach in the 19th century.
Now, just as with the parades, there's poll watching and there's poll watching. Where's that line between good poll watching and intimidation?
I mean, I think these images are critical because the sign here, pay your poll tax. When you first were sharing images with us, I immediately went to, this must be 1870. And if I were to put this on a quiz for my students, I'd actually hope that they would answer 1870, that they would understand what poll taxes were. Sadly, this is from the 1960s. And so it shows that in certain parts of the country, people are still trying to enforce that people pay poll taxes in order to vote. And so I think that showing that there isn't a lot of progress in certain parts of the nation between the 15th Amendment of 1870 and the 1960s before you get the Voting Rights Amendment of 1965, just makes all the difference in the world to have an object like this to underscore that. I think the robe speaks for itself and other people can feel free to pipe in.
Perhaps we can say, talk a little bit about people who don't vote in the voting booth, but the history of the absentee vote, starting with military voting. Lynn, I know this is an area that you've written about extensively. Can you give us a short history of the military vote?
Yeah, it starts with Pennsylvania in 1813, actually. So this is a image from 1864, where most historians put the beginning of absentee balloting because it's the time that the greatest number of absentee balloting begins to happen. But Pennsylvania had a short-lived absentee balloting for military in 1813, followed by New Jersey in 1815. By the time of the Civil War, Pennsylvania had actually gotten rid of their absentee voting in 1862, and they redid it for the 1864 presidential election. And a majority of the Union states created some form of absentee voting. It really depended upon party lines and party control of the state legislature and who believed was going to vote in that presidential election. There was an overwhelming sense that the military would be voting in favor of President Lincoln and the Republican Party. The Democrats and their candidate of Major General McClellan feared the response of the soldiers. And for those legislatures that controlled the Democratic controlled legislatures, often those states did not grant any kind of absentee voting. For instance, one I've been working with is Indiana, and a set of letters from some brothers who were in 3 different units of Indiana regiments. And one had in 1864 started to talk about a furlough that was being granted to the soldiers so that they could go home and vote in the presidential election. What had happened was that the Indiana legislature, throughout debates, decided that the soldiers would not be getting any kind of absentee provisions. It was a Democratic controlled state legislature. It was a Republican governor, friend of Lincoln, who worked with Lincoln to have Lincoln write to General Sherman and say, please send home the Indiana soldiers.
Does this get more regularized during World War II?
It does. And so Civil War is very much state by state. What happens during World War II, in large part because whereas Civil War, the regiments were based by state and you knew where to reach your soldiers. The World War II, the soldiers are around the world. These are units that are combined from multiple states. So it's up to the federal government kind of intervenes about creating a system to find those soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and to get them balloting material. The items on the smaller items there, the postcards, are to request a ballot. The other piece is to submit the ballot. And each state did have some say in those ballots and that material. The back of this one that was going to Oregon had to have a signature. Other states did not require that. One part of the whole debate about how much should the federal government be involved in the voting in World War II was about the poll tax in those states that had poll tax. And so the legislation for the absentee voting really did put on the final pieces to the states to determine. But you can see the logos there in that bright red. That was all to help the mail processing and try to speed that mail. These are both air mail pieces. These are items going across the globe. And you go to this next one. This is from the 2000s. You can see on that piece there that the soldier is holding, says election mail at the top of the address. And that's a standardized logo that's used now. And that's helped with the processing. It's both an identifier for branding logos for the customer, in this case, a voter, but also the Postal Service uses these to try to expedite these mail pieces.
Great. I'd like to just jump back to a really interesting question that came from one of the Macalester students who wants to know in African-American communities, who is doing the watching? Are those African-Americans watching African-Americans, or are there members outside of the community that are doing the watching?
Wow, that's an excellent question. And thanks for showing up, Macalester. It would depend on the time period. So if you are talking about today's election, for instance, I would say that in some neighborhoods, you're going to have both. You're going to have the Black people that are standing around trying to do what they will consider being the protection of the election. And then you also would have outside agitators that would try to be doing the intimidation. And so, and that can be traced back historically as well. I mean, it makes me think about the 1925 image with the Klansman robes. And part of that is the reason why that would be situated in 1925 is that you get your first migration of Blacks from the South to the North in the 19-teens. It's around the time of World War I. Crops have not done well in the South. People want an opportunity. It's the first time they go north. They're in urban space. Then you get the pandemic. Then you get Red Summer. Then you end up getting, it's right before the stock market crashing. There's an anxiety that Black people will try to vote in the North and be empowered. And so poll watchers are going to be of different races because they're going to be watching for different things.
Yeah.
Jumping back to another question that actually was posed for John was how ballots are dealt with for illiterate voters.
Peter, can you go to the screen with the ballots, please?
Sure.
So initially you didn't even have to know how to read because most voting was what was called viva voce, which is live voting. You stand up and you say, I vote for Steve or I vote for Bill. You just announce it. And it's seen as being able to state your vote publicly in your whole community keeps out secrecy. Politics should just be open to everyone. Obviously, there are big problems with that. Along the way, parties start introducing paper ballots. The parties were individually, for the two ballots on the right, the one from 1836 and the one from 1878, the parties printed those themselves. So a local newspaper in whatever community, I think this is Massachusetts, and I'm not sure where the Free Soil one is from. The local party newspapers are really partisan, and they would use their newspaper presses to print out these ballots. You'd have guys hanging around the polls. They used to call them poll peddlers, and then they started calling them ballot hustlers because you're really trying to force ballots on people. And you get the ballot into the hand of a person, whether they're literate or not, and they cast it in the box. So you really don't need to know how to vote. Often they're color coded. So for people who are recent immigrants, for people who don't know how to read, you can still vote your party because you recognize the Republican who gave you the ticket. You assume you're voting a Republican ticket. Now this leads to a whole war of kind of tricking illiterate voters into voting the wrong ticket by copying the color of the other side. If the Democrats are giving out purple tickets, purple ballots, Republicans would start printing purple ballots to trick illiterate voters into casting ballots for their side. So ballot trickery, we're thinking really closely about ballots this year. Ballot trickery, how you vote physically, these tiny little incremental differences make huge differences in the outcome of elections and have a long history in America of trying to steal or influence votes through this kind of trickery.
That's fascinating. We're getting close on time, so I want to jump to mail systems. There's been so much talk about slowing down the mail system, and because of the pandemic, the mails have become so important. Lynn, can you give us a little sense, a quick overview of how the mails work and what slows them down, and what speed, whether they're capable of being fast?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that go wrong in human error and part of it, and definitely kind of systems planning that causes the slowdown. What's also causes issues with the efficiency of the mail is can you plan for what's going to be in the mail and the volume that you're expecting? The picture that we're seeing that we just went past is a lot of manual work, and this is throwing newspapers. This is how mail was sorted for most of the definitely 19th century into most of the 20th century. And throughout the 20th century, it becomes a question about how much can we mechanize, how much can we automate, take less human interaction with the mail. This machine would sort the mail down to the level that it would be ready for a mail carrier to pick up their trays of mail and be able to walk that route. It would sort it down to a door-to-door kind of level of, and so the efficiency wouldn't just be in the behind the scenes processing and distribution of it, but it would also go down to that street level. It becomes a big debate during the 1950s and 60s as the volume of mail skyrockets after World War II. How do we handle this huge volume of mail? It increases more than 200% between 1940 and 1960. So this postage stamp that's issued in 1960 is somewhat of a celebratory stamp that was kind of controversial within the post office department itself, whether they should even issue it. The Postmaster General at the time was very much behind it, Arthur Summerfield, who was trying to modernize the post office department through mechanization and automation. And this project of this specialty built facility in Providence, Rhode Island, was to show how modernized they could be. The building was built to be the biggest space available to allow the most number of machines, and at the end of the year study, it was seen as a failure. Many of the machines were never turned on. The employees were not trained properly, they said. On the other hand, people said they were very happy about how quickly the mail was going through the system as well. So two sides of that story. But in the next slide you're going to show there, Peter, is we are used to times where there is a peak season for the mail, and that certainly is Christmas. How the Postal Service responds to knowing that the mail is going to rise during the months of November and December is to put more of those facilities online, more equipment online, and to hire more employees. And the next one, there's a badge for a temporary worker. This is something that happens throughout the 19th century and through today, that there is, just like in sort of retail industry, the Postal Service also hires seasonal workers for this peak season of Christmas time. And the chart here shows how you would expect the length of time it would take for your Christmas package to get somewhere. So this is a 1938 chart. Everything's from Kansas City, Missouri in this chart. So it's telling the customer what time you would expect that you would have to get your Christmas cards in the mail or your packages in the mail. So it's very much like what we're hearing in the news today about the Postal Service informing the secretaries of state when items need to get into the mail, when those ballot materials need to be turned in. So Christmas has many parallels to that voting time.
That's great. Before we go on to our last section, we have a question, an interesting question from a junior at UC Santa Barbara. And they ask, overall question of when does this idea that individual votes don't matter become common? Speaker wants to know because she says her peers say that voting doesn't matter. So this sort of philosophy about voting, true, not true, when does the change occur?
It's as old as American democracy. I mean, you see people saying it doesn't matter, the parties are the same, no one cares. Going back to, really heated elections. People say it on the eve of the Civil War. My vote doesn't matter. People say it in elections that are decided by 1,000 votes, by one vote. People will continue to say this because it seems, I think it comes from just one, people are deliberately disenfranchised. And so there's some natural sense of feeling put out because they are pushed out. But there's also just a sense that how could my vote possibly influence this huge nation? How could my individual action have an impact on such a large scale? And the amazing thing is it does. I mean, we can point to so many elections, so many decisive moments that are decided by a handful of voters in one state or another. It really goes back, and it's one of those pervasive things that you just can't kill, but it's not true.
Great. You've done a wonderful job of talking about campaigning and talking about voting. That's all behind us now, hopefully. And today we're waiting to hear the vote being counted and certified. And we certainly don't want you to tell us who's going to win, but it would be interesting to know whether counting and certifying has always been even handled in the past. And got some slides maybe to start the notion. This is from the Gore v. Bush Supreme Court case. And of course, here's what's going on. Perhaps you can explain what the issue was and whether we might see this again.
I mean, I'll speak to that if you go back to the pink sign. Where, one of the things that students have been asking me is, what are we going to talk about in class tomorrow? And I said, well, we can talk about the election, but I'm not sure if we'll have an answer. And so there seems to be a knowledge gap in terms of the fact that we have not always known the next day. In fact, if we go back and look, it's like we rarely know. And this December 2000 is the perfect artifact for us to think about that, because we didn't have a president for, I think it was maybe 6 weeks. What I would, like to see in your collection is that I think that there is a front page of a newspaper somewhere congratulating President Gore. I think that would just be outstanding, where I think someone took the risk and went to press.
Yeah, and if you go back further, could you go to the 1876 one, please? So you asked about certifying the vote. In 1876, things go essentially as wrong as they can, in that there are several contested states in this crucial election, highest turnout election in American history. And in these states of Florida, again, like Duchess was speaking about in Florida in 2000, South Carolina and Louisiana, there are warring factions in those states that both certify results for different candidates. So they both send every state has electoral votes. Within each state, both two rival parties are both vouching their electoral votes for different candidates. And, the Congress has to sort it all out. So, and it takes 5 months. So things can take a long time. Things can get really confusing before they do. I mean, these different factions are meeting in different buildings, claiming to be the official government of South Carolina. Things can get really messy. So we'll see how quickly we resolve things this time. But if history is any lesson, we should all have patience.
Well, I think that's a scary but fascinating note to end on. Duchess Harris, Lynn Heidelbaugh, John Grinspan, thank you very much. I would love to hang out with you and talk some more. Your insights and knowledge on how the systems work is really quite amazing. But we're out of time. We certainly hope that everybody will have a chance to join other sessions of this pandemic series. The next one is coming up November 24th, is Comfort Food During a Pandemic. I think it'll be a little bit less stressful than the one that we're undergoing right now. So it'll be a more upbeat. If you go to our website, americanhistory.si.edu/pandemic perspectives, you can get both recorded versions of those sessions that have passed already, and you can sign up for the upcoming sessions. And of course, we're always looking to expand the collection. So if you have ideas about what we should be collecting, send us a note at covid19@si.edu. Certainly in terms of building our COVID-19 collections, both about voting, but also about business, about home life, all aspects of COVID-19. So thank you very much for coming today. Panelists, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And I hope that everybody has a stress-free vote day today and can go to bed early.